Land of the Coyote.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the invitation to be here today to meet with everybody in the town of Duck. Certainly appreciate the discussion that we've had prior to this meeting to be able to discuss some of the details about coyotes and coyote management. I want to introduce my supervisor, Mr. Evan Stanford. He's the Coastal Region Supervisor. He supervises 3 district biologists and a technical assistance biologist on the coast. So he gets to deal with a lot of issues, gets to deal with a lot of counties for our 3 coastal districts. So I'm Chris Turner. I'm our district biologist for District 1, which is 13 northeastern counties.
Wow.
I tell everybody I think I work the best district in the state because we got lots of wildlife and just a few people, except for parts of the year. And you're well aware of what happens here in another couple of months. Things start to change as far as the density of people. But I was asked to come here today to talk about some coyotes, in particular coyote conflict management and coyote management in general. So we have, let me get it on the right one. We have given several talks on the Outer Banks over the last couple of years regarding coyotes, and there have certainly been a lot of questions that have come up from most of the towns up and down the Outer Banks. We gave a talk at Southern Shores back in December that we were asked to more or less have a workshop just to kind of give some details about what coyotes are, what they're not, the tools in the toolbox, so to speak, to manage a coyote population and to manage nuisance type issues as well. So this is a continuation of that talk today. I want to start out talking a little bit about the history of coyotes because they're what we would call the new species on the block as far as North Carolina goes. Historically, they're not native to this state. Historically, we've not had coyotes in this state. But I want to show you really the beginning of our coyote population many years ago and kind of take you into the present as far as where the coyotes have come from and where the population is now. In regard to that. Then we want to talk some about coyote management as far as some of the human implications of having a coyote population here on the Outer Banks and within the state. And then to talk about what we would say are the tools in the toolbox as far as dealing with individual situations and dealing with a coyote population as far as something that has to be managed across the state. So yeah, I think the primary questions that I get are here. Where did they come from? What are coyotes in North Carolina different than they are anywhere else? What impact do they have, and what can we do about them? That tends to be the primary question that I have certainly had many calls on over the last couple of years on the Outer Banks. Description of coyotes. I just so happened that I brought one with me. This is a coyote pelt, and it looks real similar to the picture there. Their coloration varies considerably between individuals. So somebody might say, I saw a coyote, and they say it was black. Some people might say they saw a coyote and it was more red looking. There's all different shades of coyote pelts and all different colorations. Typically, when we see black coyotes, some of them are jet black, we tend to see those when coyotes first become established in a place. I think back years ago, you probably would see more coyotes with a black color face, black variation, than you do now. But it's always interesting, some of the calls we get. They're not a very big animal. We're looking at something that's typically between 20 to 25 to 40 pounds would be a big coyote. They can certainly get bigger than that. But that's generally what we're looking at when it comes to coyotes. When we talk about coyote habitat, We're talking about, well, any wildlife habitat, we're talking about the place that an animal can survive and live and carry out its life, where it gets all of its food, water, shelter, and space. That's what habitat is. And I think when you look at this particular picture, what types of land use don't you see there? Your coyotes can live anywhere. There have been some studies that have gone on over the years. One particular study that happened in Chicago many years ago, where they had radios on coyotes, radio collars, that they looked at the coyote population of Chicago. Very interesting information, because what it means is that there's nowhere that they can't survive. They can make a go of it almost anywhere, all the way from the mountains to the coast. They can use agricultural lands. They can use highly developed areas, including towns. And you can see a picture there of the ocean. Who would have thought that we would have coyotes living at the beach? Well, I think as we go through this presentation, you'll see that maybe it's not that surprising, really, that we have coyotes from one end of the state to the other at this point. This is a good example of coyotes using urban areas. I think this is the city of Raleigh, where coyotes have passed through Raleigh. They had on radio collars through some studies that have gone on. If a coyote can live in the middle of Raleigh, where can't they live? Coyote food, that's where a lot of the discussions come from. Coyotes are omnivorous. They're carnivorous, meaning that they eat meat, but they also can eat almost anything. So the food sources vary by season, and their diets vary by season as well. Some parts of the year they may mainly eat fruit when it's available. Some parts of the year they may make a living off of, say, roadkill deer or deer carcasses that they might find. Small mammals, including mice and rabbits and birds. Whatever they can catch, they can make a go of it. I got a picture of a watermelon field up there. We've had calls over the years about watermelon damage from coyotes. So what can a coyote eat, including cats? That becomes, I think it starts to hit home when we start to look at the fact that coyotes just consider cats as another small mammal. It's another food source that's available to them. So their diet varies. Historically, the green area is where we had coyotes that have always been there. All the records back in the 1700s and before, we had coyotes in the central part of the country, in the plains and in the desert southwest. They've always been there. I told a group the other week that when I was growing up, what one of my favorite cartoons was? Yeah, everybody who's old enough remembers the Coyote and Roadrunner. And every time you saw a coyote and a roadrunner, you saw a cactus, right? Big cliffs, around the Grand Canyon and down in Arizona and Texas. And that's where we've historically had coyotes. Over time, because of land use changes and because of some things that we're going to show you about the species, the distribution in this country has continued to change when it comes to where coyotes can live. Today, we have coyotes almost across all of North America. So it's not surprising to know that we have coyotes in the southeast. I want to show you. I kind of go through these pretty quickly, but this is the history of coyote documentation in the state of North Carolina. It goes all the way back to the 1930s. When coyotes were documented in Gaston County. Now, this is not a coyote population per se. This is evidence of a coyote. This is a coyote that's been killed by some means or run over by a car. Some record that came to the Wildlife Commission at that time to track the expanding population of coyotes in this state. So you see, prior to 1983, we just had a few counties in the state, and then. Some of those expansions into this state probably came from what we have documented as some known illegal releases in other parts of the country, particularly south of us. So as you watch coyotes move from the west towards the east, you start to see a lead edge of where coyotes have established a population. So between 1983 and 1985, things start to change. By 1988, we had more records. By 1990, we had significant records on the coast. By 96, I'm going to say that's probably 2/3 of the state at least that has records of coyotes there. By the year 2000, we've got coyotes continue to expand. By 2003, Dare County is the only county there that did not have a documented coyote at that point. But by 2005, we had them statewide. I've had reports of coyotes on the Outer Banks actually since 2009. So really over the last couple of years have I started to receive phone calls regarding people seeing coyotes along the Outer Banks, from the top to the bottom. But we've actually had coyotes present since 2009, for quite a few years prior to everybody starting to see them or understand that we had them. And this really starts to answer some questions about how coyote populations work. Coyotes, they may use a big area in their daily movements, but they can make some really long trips. This is actually from a study that was at Fort Bragg. You can see the little box up there around Fayetteville below Lee County. Fort Bragg military DOD base there had a coyote study several years ago where they put satellite collars on coyotes. Those satellite collars are tracked by satellite every certain number of hours or a certain number of days. They can set the number of locations that they receive. But they put satellite collars on coyotes, and what they saw pretty quickly was that some coyotes make a really long distance trip. They make a long-distance move, or we would call that a dispersal, meaning they leave the place that they're actually born, and they take off to go to a place where they can establish their own home range and own territory. This is a good example of a dispersal out of Fort Bragg that wound up almost in Georgia. I think altogether that was I think it was 100 and let me see what that was. Basically looking at dispersals of between 60 and 300 miles. That's a long dispersal. This is another long dispersal. Same place, different coyote, wound up almost in northern Virginia. Basically left Fort Bragg on March 24th, made it to Greensboro by April 3rd, and left there by the 25th of April. And by July 2nd, was in northern Virginia. So that's altogether in 3 months the animal moved 226 miles. That really starts to tell the story about what coyotes can do. So I think it really starts to answer the question, well, how in the world do coyotes get on the Outer Banks? Well, they can do it naturally, because they're constantly on the move. I always look at it like this: if you collar a few animals and you have some percentage of them that make movements like this in dispersal, what's it really like across the state? You may see a coyote in a few weeks that if you see him, you may think he was born here, but he may have come from another state totally. The potential's there. So that's part of being a coyote. The other part of a coyote population is the fact that they can actually adapt to mortality. They can adapt to the types of mortality that remove individuals from the population every year, including vehicles, disease, or harvest, either by trapping or hunting typically. The population can respond to changes in that mortality. So where we may have small litter sizes, low pup survival rates, and a lower percentage of yearlings breeding, which just adds to the number of young each year. When we start to put high mortality on that population, what we see is decreased competition within the population. So as numbers start to fall, you start to see more resources available for the ones that are left. The result of that is the animals can respond by increasing litter sizes, maybe even doubling litter sizes. Pup survival rates will go up because there's more resources to feed those animals, and you can get a higher percentage of yearlings that are doing the breeding as well. Maybe from 30% yearlings breeding to 50% yearlings breeding. So that is a part of having more resources for the individuals that are present. When mortality changes and you lower mortality, you see the opposite is true. When the population starts to get higher because of you're not losing as many individuals each year, what you typically see is the litter sizes go down to be in keeping with the resources that are available to those animals in that population. So what that means is that chances of removing all the coyotes, I'm going to say, are zero. I've had a lot of people, particularly on the Outer Banks, talk about eradication. They talk about we don't want any. Well, that's based on what we know about coyotes and coyote populations. They're here to stay. So where that takes us is towards the interactions that coyotes have. Once we know they're here, they're not going away, we start to ask ourselves the questions, well, what are they doing while they're here? They're here to stay. We've got to coexist at some level. What we have noticed is, and know through research, is that coyotes typically do not impact the wildlife resources that are out there to the extent that they damage the resource. When certain populations are high, they may use those species more as food, but when the numbers fall off, what you see is they back off because they can eat almost anything. They don't have to rely on one species. One thing that I think we certainly have seen, I certainly have heard this, I think, is red foxes and coyotes, they compete directly for the same resources. And typically when you see coyotes become established somewhere, what you may notice is that you're not seeing as many red foxes on the landscape as there were. So that's a part of it, but I think the purpose of today is to talk about human and coyote interactions. As we hear about it, statewide, not just here on the Outer Banks, but statewide. We certainly get calls about people's concerns about potential for interaction between people and wildlife. Some of the ones that we typically get calls on, or people call to say, well, are coyotes spreading diseases? Are they a safety factor for humans? Or are they a property damage factor? Do they cause damage to people's property? I would include pets there, when it comes down to property. One thing that we have certainly seen is that coyotes, just like any mammal, can carry rabies. But the number of animals that have been positive, at the state lab have been very, very few. This is since 1990. Between 1990 and 2015, there were 14 coyotes that were tested for rabies for whatever reason that showed up to be positive for rabies. When you compare the coyote positive animals to the rest of the animals that typically we have associated rabies with, particularly as rabies vectors, which are species that can carry rabies but not show it, you see quite a few other species are probably more of a factor when it comes to rabies as a disease, within our state. So I think one thing that I certainly have noticed is that a lot of the calls I get are generated out of people seeing a coyote and being afraid of what might happen. I think fear drives a public perception when it comes to predators in general, but certainly to coyotes. A lot of times people think there's more coyotes here than there actually are. You may see coyotes more at certain times of the year, and certainly the fact that we live on I don't live here, but the Outer Banks is a linear, very, very narrow spit of land. I think the potential to see coyotes pretty regularly is fairly high in some parts of the year. But maybe it makes things look like there's more than there are because you see them more regular. Bottom line is just seeing a coyote is not a problem. We know we've got coyotes, we know the species, and we know what they do, but just seeing one is not necessarily a concern. In reality, most of the issues that do come up when it comes down to coyotes and other wildlife, not just coyotes, but it comes back down to food. Food sources around houses or around subdivisions or around town can certainly attract wildlife that they've got to have calories too, and if they can get the calories they need without expending a lot of energy, that's what they choose to do. That's what they need to do. It's very important that they don't expend any more energy than they have to meet their daily requirements. So I think a lot of times unsecured food, such as pet food, bird seed, and garbage and table scraps can contribute to animals that start to hang around a food source and may hang around to the point that they become habituated to people, meaning that there's people around, but the food source is so good that they overcome their fear of people to utilize that particular food source. So food is always a big part of the equation. Certainly we've shown that coyotes can live in urban areas. They can live around people. I think what it really comes down to is that we always try to take the steps to make sure that the food sources are not as big a part of an equation. I think it's really hard to totally change the picture, but we can, as individuals, make the decisions on our own property to work together to minimize the amount of free food that's available to coyotes. Coyotes can live around people, but we haven't documented any unprovoked attacks in this state when it comes down to coyotes in the vicinity of people. So that's, I think that kind of takes us down into, well, we got them, now we're going to do with them. In the end, management of a population is certainly important when it comes down to the big picture and to the long term. So I wanted to talk some about some of we'll say the tools in the toolbox, the tools that are available to manage the coyote population, that's the big picture, but also to manage situations that might arise with individual animals. That's a different type situation than population management. I think it's important to note that population management is not damage management. If you got property damage or you got issues with coyotes, managing the population doesn't necessarily change the whole situation, but it certainly reduces the number of animals that are available to cause issues. That's always a part of, that's kind of where they come together. We've already mentioned that there's no silver bullet when it comes down to managing problems, when it comes to wildlife. The eradication word, it comes up a lot, but I think when you look at these two factors, as we know exist with coyote populations across the board, I think it's certainly not an option to say we're going to get rid of all the coyotes. I think what's interesting is it's been shown that you would have to actually remove over 70% of the standing population annually to push the population down to a level that you could say we're not going to have them anymore if we keep going. That's not really an option. That's a really high level of harvest that we always had to go back to managing the population annually with population management goals. So most of the calls that I get, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, have I really started to get some calls, have dealt with the presence of coyotes, where people may or may not have seen a coyote, but they've heard that there's one there, or maybe they have seen one, but it was just a sighting. A lot of times presence in the area opens the door for discussions about concerns of pet safety, which I think once you know there's coyotes around, I think it certainly is a positive thing that we would have the discussion about, well, we know they're here, what can we do to do what we can to prevent issues from arising? You know, anytime we're talking about issues or talking about problems or conflicts, it's very important to define the problem. You know, if you see a coyote, that may or may not be an issue. That's probably not an issue at all. Now, if you see one repeatedly in the same place over and over and over again, day after day after day, I think you have to start asking yourself, well, why do I keep seeing them in the same place? Typically, free food, is a driving factor in having something in the same place over and over and over again. You know, you see examples of some of the food sources that are available. You know, I think we could probably all look at our houses and look at our yards and have a really good idea about some things that maybe we could do a little bit better when it comes down to the potential to have wildlife coming and eating repeatedly at our houses or in our yards. I love this picture because that's a coyote checking out a bird feeder. Now, we think about coyotes eating meat and eating small mammals and rabbits and maybe fruit, but even a bird feeder can become an issue in some situations. For me, if I had a bird feeder at my house and I had a coyote that was visiting every day, the first step that I would take would be to put the food up. That would be the first thing, because you're probably not going to continue to see it at that point. You know, they're utilizing it as they find it, and they'll use it until it's gone. That's usually how wildlife tends to operate. Sometimes it's not food. Sometimes it's habitat. Sometimes it might be an undeveloped lot beside you that you have a coyote denning there in the spring, and so you see them repeatedly over and over again, because you're not attracting the coyote, but you're a travel way for the coyote that has to repeatedly visit one particular spot. So I think when we start to look at what can contribute to an animal being in the same place over and over and over again, I think we always have to look back towards particularly these two things. Sometimes we can make a change that has a positive effect. Sometimes it may not be on our property. Yeah, I think it can get very complicated, because sometimes the issue may occur somewhere else, but you're continuing to see them. That's where I think everybody, when we come together and work together as being aware and having the discussion, I think we can have an effect on a larger scale when we work together that way. You know, the toolkit includes lethal and non-lethal tools. Non-lethal tools, it always begins with education. You know, I think any opportunity we have to talk about coyotes and to talk about issues and how to prevent them, that's a great place to begin. Because a lot of times we can stop things before they start. Now, can we solve all the problems? Can we prevent everything? No, we've got coyotes and we can have issues, but the steps we take on a personal level, I think when we tie it all together, can certainly have an effect on the number of complaints and the number of conflicts that may come up. Bottom line is, whenever we're talking about conflicts or we're talking about issues, we always have to try and match the problem with the tool. You know, not every tool fits the same problem. You know, I think by beginning with education and understanding what tools are available, we can have the discussion about, well, which tools apply where, which tools will be effective in this place but maybe not effective somewhere else. Which tools are acceptable to certain people or to certain subdivisions or homeowners associations. Yeah, I think that's where the candid discussion about, here's what we can do, what do we choose to do? You know, how can this work? You know, again, education is always first. You know, we've had the opportunity to talk to quite a few people up and down the beach at this point, and you know, I think this has been a good way of breaching the subject about trying to help everybody understand coyotes a little bit and why we got them, why they're not going away. Education is important. Our website is a great resource when it comes down to providing information to people that they might understand as well. The education helps us with modifying human behavior. You know, I think sometimes that once we understand some things, I think we can have discussions with the people around us. If there's some things that we see that would be helpful to somebody, we can bring it up. Removal of attractants, leashing of dogs, cats indoors. You know, I think that's probably one of the biggest ones that I've seen as far as trying to prevent some issues from occurring, but become very important when it comes down to pets. Really kind of keeping it in mind. If we know we got coyotes around, what can I do to prevent an issue? Modifying habitat, which would include manicuring lawns, basically keeping things in a really clean condition, help not contribute to issues, because when we keep everything cleaned up and off the ground, we don't have a lot of the rodents and other small mammals that might live in a wood pile, that might attract the coyote. Or other wildlife as well. You know, I think those are some steps that people are trying to take all the time. Fencing always comes up. You know, if you want to change the travel way of things, that may be one option in some places. You know, as far as trying to keep things contained the best you can, and not letting things freely through. But again, not every option fits every place. Because I know there's some places you might not have options for fencing by ordinance or by homeowners agreement. So when we talk about lethal techniques, that's basically hunting and trapping is what we're talking about. And we also talk about depredation, which goes back to property damage. We're talking about annual population management. That's a large-scale management activity that it won't eradicate coyotes, right? We can't even go there. But we can certainly use the coyotes as a resource. You know, they are a wildlife resource. But we can also, when we are managing the population, we're reducing the number of individuals at some level. So at that point, once you start to manage numbers, that has an effect on what individuals are available to cause issues later. That's certainly doing something when it comes down to that. Our coyote hunting regulations in North Carolina are pretty liberal. In 95 counties, there's a year-round, day or night coyote season. Yeah, that's one avenue that hunters and trappers can use in order to manage the population. No bag limit. Basically, artificial lights are allowed, electronic calling devices for coyotes. You know, there's lots of ways of doing this as far as managing numbers long-term. But we have to keep in mind that there are 5 counties in the state that have a special set of coyote rules. Dare County is one of those counties. So we have Dare, Washington, Hyde, Terrell, and Beaufort counties have a special set of hunting rules that you can see them in our regulations digest. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details on it, but some of the things that apply in 95 counties don't apply in the 5 counties here as the Red Wolf area. So the regulations that are available, basically there's no night hunting in these counties. There's a special hunting permit that has to be acquired. It's free. There's certainly reporting of any coyotes that are taken. There's more involved in these 5 counties than in the rest of the state for that reason. But in the end, I think it's pretty important to note that certainly depending on where you are, hunting in general may not be as effective tool depending on the landscape. I think the Outer Banks is one of those places that particular set of rules may not have much of an effect at all here on the Outer Banks. Certainly when we talk about hunting, we talk about the harvest of coyotes. You can see this graph goes from 2002 to 2014. The green bars are the harvest by hunting. You can see that harvest has continued to increase over the years. I think it really matches what you see here over the years. We've certainly got more coyotes than we used to, as they become established. The yellow line in the right-hand side of the graph is actually the harvest by trapping. So there's a considerable difference in the number of coyotes that are taken by regulated trapping versus the number of coyotes taken statewide by regulated hunting. So it would look like hunting takes more animals than trapping does, and that's true. But I think what you'll see here is the number of animals taken per person, per trapper, versus per hunter is certainly different. Trapping is an efficient and effective way of dealing with numbers across the board. So trapping is certainly one of the tools that is available when it comes to managing coyote population. I think I wanted to gear it locally, towards the Outer Banks, and I certainly think when we talk about hunting, hunting would be a challenge here as well. It is a tool in the toolbox, but whether it will be an effective or efficient tool, it all depends on where you're talking about. We have high human density here. I looked at the GIS site to pull down this. You can see Duck Country Club, the Duck Golf Course down there at Kitty Hawk. And then as we go, we almost got the town of Duck in there. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of small parcels of land. Hunting and trapping by permission of the landowner, that can certainly become a challenge and can reduce the effectiveness or the incentive to hunt and trap where it is allowed. Just because you're talking about small parcels, we're talking about an animal that can use 1,000 or several thousand acres, and you're talking about 2.5 or less acre parcels. Hundreds and thousands of them up and down the Outer Banks. So that's hard. Where is hunting? Where is it feasible? By ordinance, it may not be allowed in a lot of places. By safety, it may not be allowed in a lot of places. So it is a tool, but how effective it is or whether it's useful or not, don't know. It all depends. Depends on where you're at. We're in trapping season right now. This is regulated trapping season. You can see in most of the state it comes in November 1st through February 28th is when licensed trappers can actually trap. With a trapping license, they can trap fur bearers. And then the green, December 1st to February 28th. We're here at the tail end of trapping season, but that is certainly one tool in the toolbox that can have a management effect, as far as managing a coyote population annually. So there are special regulations by the state, by the Wildlife Commission, that put in place to manage regulated trapping, to regulate trapping that way. Certainly, it's not something that can be done without some preparation and without proper education in how to do it and in the best ways to do it. One thing that comes up is why anyone would want to trap some places. Trappers have to have incentive in order to be attracted to an area in order to trap. And certainly our fox laws in North Carolina do not fall under the Wildlife Resources Commission. Our fox trapping seasons are generated by the legislature, not the Wildlife Commission. So what I show here is there's trapping laws for foxes across the state. They vary by county. Dare County is one that does not have a fox trapping season currently. So that certainly may open the door for people to choose not to put effort in certain places. So the Wildlife Commission does not have the authority over foxes, the legislature does, but certainly county by county, the potential to use trapping may be limited when it comes to coyotes. When it goes there, because foxes had to be released in this county when trapping season's in. Again, some of the same challenges for trapping, high human density, what tools can apply or not apply, hard to say, all depends on exactly where you're at. Certainly, we have good coyote habitat here on the Outer Banks. So there's potential there to use trapping in certain places, but I certainly would say it's safe to say that not everyone agrees that that's a feasible tool, depending on who you are and where you are. Whether it's feasible or not, there's always things to remember. Where can trapping be effective? Hard to say. It may or may not be a tool that can be applied. Depredation permits are special permits that can allow trapping outside the regulated trapping season, whereas regulated trapping deals with population management on a large scale. Depredation deals with individual animals that are causing property damage or problems. So it's very different. Damage can occur year-round. So there is certainly an option in some situations to allow, by special permit to a homeowner or a landowner, trapping to take place to deal with individual problem animals that come up. That's always a part of it. It applies to other species as well as coyotes. Depredation permits can be issued by wildlife damage control agents for some species. When there's nuisance-type work that a homeowner or a landowner has requested, a depredation permit could be issued to allow somebody to trap outside the season by a second party, meaning the homeowner or landowner doesn't necessarily have to do the trapping. They could have a second party do it on their behalf, who's on the permit. Damage control agents can issue permits for some species, but only the Wildlife Commission can issue depredation permits in the 5-county area, including Dare County. So if problems arise and somebody says, I'd like to talk to somebody about what I can do about an individual animal, only the Wildlife Commission personnel, including myself, would have that discussion as far as whether a permit would be issued in Dare County. One thing to keep in mind is under depredation permits, animals cannot be relocated, meaning you may have somebody that says, I have a problem and I need this animal removed, but I just want you to go put it out somewhere else. We don't move animals around that way because we don't want to take one person's problem that is associated with a place, sometimes with conditions at that place, and put it on somebody else. That's a part of how the permit system works. So, and coyotes can't be relocated. Coyotes would be euthanized under a depredation permit. So that's just something to always keep in mind. The same is true for raccoons. The same is true for foxes under depredation permits. That's always something people have to keep in mind, is the solution that works is not to take one person's problem and put it on somebody else. We certainly don't want that. And the people who would receive it wouldn't want that either. So just to kind of sum it up, when it comes down to hunting as a tool, certainly there may be opportunities, but I think they're very limited opportunities, here on the Outer Banks. I think anybody that talks about hunting needs to certainly be very familiar with the regulations, because there's special coyote rules here for Dare County and for other counties. And you should always talk to local authorities prior to starting to undertake any activities like that. It's always good to get it on the front end in preparation so that everybody can understand what is feasible and what is allowed. Very important that people do that. Again, I note special rules for coyote hunting in this 5-county area. Regulated trapping. So, some of the same, I think some of the same hurdles for trapping, maybe not as many in most places. High human density and small parcel sizes, they create certainly challenges for being able to trap effectively because you've got to have a written permission of the property owner in order to trap under a trapping license. So what applies here as far as trapping goes, hard to say. Probably takes more effort in order to do things that would be effective. I think we may, I'm going to show you some things in just a few minutes through our website that we actually maintain a list of licensed trappers on our website who have said that they certainly, with a trapping license during the regulated season, they certainly put their efforts towards certain species, and we maintain a list of licensed trappers for many species that is, I think, a really good contact point for any landowner who says, you know what, I wouldn't mind having somebody trap. There's people that you can talk to, and that information is available on our website. Depredation permits, they are issued in very specific situations to lethally remove individual coyotes or other wildlife that might be causing issues. It's case by case. Certainly we have those discussions and decide whether that's a feasible tool or whether that's the proper tool to use. Basically, for Dare County, any nuisance type situations, I'm always available. I'm going to have some cards available, and you can find my information on the website as well. But any calls that I receive to have one-on-one conversations about problems that might be going on, we can certainly have those regarding where a permit might fit. Where it might be the best way of dealing with a certain situation. So in summary, I kind of hit the high seven points. Certainly, when we look at coyotes as a species, they're survivors. Over the decades, out west in particular, where they've always had coyotes, I'm going to say coyotes have been persecuted for a long period of time because people may not want coyotes around them because of livestock issues in some places, all kinds of issues, but they're here to stay. It's hard to push them down to a level that you're not going to see a coyote, which is fortunate because just seeing one's not a problem. I think it really, seeing a coyote or hearing about them opens the door for discussing not just annual management, but personal management of our own property or food sources. Anything that we think might become a problem once we know what can happen, I think we would have those discussions as a way of preventing some conflicts as we can. I think it's important to work together. Particularly in communities or in subdivisions where you may have homeowners association meetings. That's a great opportunity to keep the options out there for discussion and apply what can be applied in a proper way. So problems can arise. I think it's important to assess the issue and then consider the tools that might be available. So you can always call me. This is some of my information here. That's my office number. You can get all this information on our website as well. Our website at ncwildlife.org actually has a little tab on there that says "Have a Wildlife Problem." And when you go there, you're basically finding a clearinghouse of information, of regulations, of options, and of people who can be contacted to help with some issues as they arise. We also have trapper education and trapper information that go along with our regulations, particularly our BMPs for trapping, which are our best management practices that are intended to help people trap in a way that it's productive and safe. Basically, that would lay the tools out there that are most efficient and effective for doing this type of work. So I'm going to show you a little bit more here in a second, but the little tab at the bottom, we now have a wildlife helpline that's available in our Raleigh office. It's Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. You can email requests or questions. You can actually make a phone call and talk to a biologist who can lead you through the process of dealing with issues as they arise, or better understanding what a problem is and what a problem is not. So it's a really great resource. I actually have I brought some cards with me that are helpline cards that have the 1-800 number on it. It is a great resource for those people who may come here only for a short period of time. You know, I think that's always a challenge here that most parts of the state may not have to deal with, is that every week there's a new group of people who may not understand some things that you understand. The helpline is a great resource when it comes to providing them with somebody to talk to who can help them with an issue while they're visiting. I think that's just a really great tool. So let me see if we got any questions about what we just talked about. I think we can have those questions now. And then before I leave, I just wanted to kind of hit some of our website tabs just to kind of show you what you're going to see when you go there and some of the information that's there that can be helpful to you. So any questions?
Open it up for questions. Carol?
Want to get that?
Chris?
Yes, ma'am.
Hold on, we're going to get a mic, Carol.
Do the coyote exhibit different behaviors when they move in packs? And like if you're walking and you encounter a group or one, what are you supposed to do to get them to shoo off?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about coyotes, a lot of times people they might talk about packs, but what you're probably actually seeing most of the year is family units, family groups. So you may have a couple of the adult coyotes, and then a couple of the subadult coyotes that might still be present, and then you might have pups. They might all be almost the same size, but as a unit that way, they stay together and they might hunt together for a while before everybody gets spread out, wherever they're going to go. I think one thing that you certainly always want to keep in mind is that if you've got a dog in particular, dogs being canines and coyotes being canines, they got something that goes on a little different between individuals than go on between coyotes and other animals. Canines are territorial towards each other in a lot of these cases, and some of the calls that I've had over the last couple of years have probably been a territorial response of the coyote or coyotes towards a dog that may be close to the same size, that they get so focused on each other that they just totally ignore you. If you got a dog on a leash, they may totally ignore the person because they're so intent on each other. I've had that several times, that has come up. I think anything that would help snap them out of that, particularly noise, or if you're able to back up with a dog and get out of the situation, get some distance there. I think that's the primary action that I think you would take. I was talking to somebody a while ago that was talking about having an air horn with them. Did they just keep with them? I think a whistle or air horn, the benefit may not just be trying to run something off. It may be the benefit of now other people kind of know that things are going on. which can benefit situations other than with coyotes. So I don't know how to prevent every conflict, but I think you would always do what you can. We would call it hazing. That would take the steps to remind the coyote there's a person involved here, that they would go on. That is a lot easier to do when there's not food involved, or when there's not a den involved. Where particularly during the spring, you could have coyotes that den somewhere, have a den with pups, that if a dog comes close to it or a person comes close to it, you may find out that there's a coyote den back there with pups, and they're certainly, may bark. Let somebody know that you're getting too close. I think those are all things that we can walk away from typically. So I think to be aware and to have that conversation with other people so that everybody kind of knows there may be some places that you might want to avoid for some period of time. Yes, sir.
As you know, we're a tourist community. I have seen incidences where people have tried to hand feed a red fox.
Yes, sir.
They do this with the wild horses up in Kerala. Do you think it's the town's responsibility to educate the tourist not to try to hand feed or encourage feeding of the wild animals, including the coyotes?
Right. That's a really good question, because if you have people that are intentionally feeding with the intention of getting as close as they can to wildlife, certainly that would be something you would not want to have happen, because you're opening the door for contact between a fox and a person. I think a lot of it comes down to education. I don't know that you can prevent every single instance, but I think where the discussion really goes is that I've never really seen a situation where there was just one person involved in that. Most of the situations I've seen that were leaning towards that having happened, there were more people involved, and I would hope that somebody that found out that was going on would let that person know that you're really potentially causing some behavioral changes for this animal that may affect somebody that may come in later. I think that's really the community part of it, that certainly somebody who saw that type of behavior in a person would want to let the people around know, and to let that person know that they're causing problems. I think I know what the response from the one feeding might be. When somebody says you need to stop doing that, I wouldn't hesitate to let other people know as well. I wouldn't, if I get a call about something like that, then I'm certainly going to have a discussion with that particular person as well. I can't prevent everything either, but certainly there are situations that we don't want to have happening. I think generally most people probably know that feeding by hand something that's wild is a really bad idea. It's a bad idea to not feed by hand, just to throw food or to have food available to see how close we can get things up in the yard. That's exactly what we've been talking about. Those type situations, it starts with feeding openly, and then sometimes it can turn into animal behavior that would actually approach a person. I certainly would want to hear about anything like that. Yes, ma'am.
What is the lifespan of a coyote?
Lifespan of a coyote, I would imagine in captivity is always one thing, in the wild something else. Most coyotes, I'd be surprised if you get coyotes that make it 5 years. But I'm not going to say you couldn't get one that would make it to 10. Just like with most wildlife species, most animals don't make it past being a juvenile. So, most animals may not make it 1 year. But once they get big enough and old enough, you certainly, I wouldn't be surprised to have, canines can live a long time in general, but they live a really hard life. When it comes down to all the mortality that is around them all the time, whether it's vehicles or disease or accidents, all kinds of things can happen. I think that what you generally see is a high turnover in the population. I've dealt with, ever since I've been in this district since 2005, I've spent a lot of time on the Outer Banks talking about wildlife issues, particularly nuisance and feeding type issues. During that time, really only until the last 2 or 3 years have we talked about coyotes as being a part of the picture. It's always been raccoons and possums and foxes. That's, we certainly got habitat for those species as well. And we got a lot of those critters here, from top to bottom. We got habitat for them. And I think one of the things that always has astounded me is that where we don't have hunting or trapping, where that's not a big part of the management of those species, they don't live forever. I would say vehicles and disease, where we don't have hunting and trapping, is certainly primary forms of mortality, because the population will be managed. Whether we do what we can to manage numbers, it will be managed by, naturally. And I'm amazed at the number of road-killed animals I see. Every time I see one on the Outer Banks, I'm just reminded that's probably the primary form of mortality outside of disease, is vehicles. Yes, sir.
What is your current estimate of the number of coyotes on the northern Outer Banks, say Oregon Inlet North?
Yeah, we don't have a population estimate for the Outer Banks, and I think when you look at the satellite transmitter information, I think you see that it would be very difficult to count every one, because there are some coyotes that they never establish a territory, they never settle down, they stay constantly on the move. And you saw some of that in dispersal, where you get long distance movements, they're here today, gone tomorrow kind of thing. We have some coyotes, here as well, it's just part of the population, that we would call transient coyotes. They never settled in one place, and they just continue to move, looking for an open territory that they can take a part of and make a pair with another coyote to do what they do in a territory. So we don't have an estimate of the number. I certainly think that because of the way the land lays, we would probably, what's perceived as inflated, probably considerably inflated. It does not take as many coyotes as you would think to be very obvious when you've just got a real narrow place. I certainly don't doubt, if you have a coyote here today, it wouldn't surprise me to have them in Whalebone, in a month or a week. They're really can really travel when they go. But to answer your question, we don't have a population estimate, because it's very, very difficult. That's one of the more difficult things that I think we do in wildlife management, is try to come up with a density, or we can never get a full estimate, a true estimate.
Hi guys, for those of you that don't know me, I'm the new Director of Public Information for Duck. My name's Christian Legner, and I just wanted to bring up that Sandy Cross and I have been working with the Commission to create a website, our webpage that will go on the Duck website about wildlife and duck. Right now, we're going to start by focusing on animals that might be nuisances and how to deal with them, and so we'll be putting some of those tools up there, good contact information, tips that we've talked to the Commission about. So that'll be available not only for people who live here, but for tourists in the summer, and we can direct them there. And that page can also be expanded in the future if there are other wildlife issues you guys would like to see.
Yeah, I think that's a really great educational step for particularly, not just for residents, year-round residents, but for visitors to be readily available, that they would understand what they're actually seeing or hearing.
And we'll have, Benny's here today doing some filming. Our next Destination Dare will also include a lot of these tips, so look out for that.
Thank you. I just, if we got just a few minutes,
Yes.
I'd kind of like to just, if we can, just run through a couple of our website links that I think once you see it, you understand what a very important tool this can be when it comes to the first step, which is education. I haven't ever done this off of a PowerPoint, but let's just see what happens. Oh, something's happening. Yeah, slow's good. Yeah, this is actually our website at ncwildlife.org. There's part of it. If you look at the little box on the left with the yellow box in it, it says "At Your Service." One of the tabs there says "Have a wildlife problem," "Have a problem." That's a great place to send people if they want, number one, to understand what they might be seeing, to be able to distinguish a problem from maybe not a problem. And it actually links into a clearinghouse of information as far as management options and contacts. So that's Have a Problem. I'll show you what it looks like. That's where you go when you click on the link. It says "Have a Problem." The top says "Find assistance with wildlife problems." That's typically where people go if they have property damage or they have situations with nuisance wildlife. Nuisance being, I don't want it here, I don't like this. What can I do to help deal with these types of issues outside of damage? The second tab is injured and orphaned wildlife. It actually links you to some licensed rehabilitators when somebody finds an injured owl or finds an injured seabird it happens all the time, doesn't it? It does. Lots of calls off the beach. But that's a great contact list in order for somebody to make contact with somebody who can guide them in the right direction as far as trying to deal with an injured animal. Sick and diseased wildlife, it actually gets down into some of the detailed information about what we would like to understand about a situation when it comes down to sick or diseased wildlife, particularly deer. We always want to hear if you find a deer that's obviously sick, we certainly will want to hear about that because we're always doing some surveillance and monitoring of our deer population. So when you go into, let's see if it did it. Wow, this is good. When you go down to Have a Problem, there's actually a list of publications by species called Coexisting with Wildlife. That's the name of the series. And you can see there, it goes on past this. I think there's more than just these species. But there's information about alligators, bats, beavers, bears, Canada geese, coyotes, deer, foxes, raccoons, snakes, and I'm not sure what's on down the list. But when you go on there are PDF files that are available that actually get into the biology of those species and really get into some of the problems that can occur with those species, and then gets into some of the solutions for dealing with those problems. I think that's a great resource for people that may repeatedly have the same types of issues to gain an understanding of not just the species, but of some of the activities that can be done to help mitigate that problem or deal with that types of problem. So then the last thing I wanted to show you, and you can get to this underneath the Have a Wildlife Problem page too. This is actually under, at the top, you see the second little tab says Conserving. If you click on Conserving, there's a tab for species. It has great species accounts of many species in this state. So, not everybody's calling to complain about a problem, right? Some people just want to understand where they might find something, what they're seeing, whether we have a certain species in this state or where they might find it, to have a viewing opportunity. I put coyotes up here, but basically there's always there's a species overview. And then you can see for coyotes, the regulations tab gets into the coyote rules in this state, including the 5-county area. Have a problem, it links back to nuisance type issues. And then there's management, which includes information about hunting and trapping, and specific information about the species. And then some related links and photos. It basically is a clearinghouse. So that's I just think when you get onto the ncwildlife.org and you start to look for specifics, these are some good places to start. Particularly it's the first step in educating people. Is to have some good, solid information about these species that we have, not just at the beach, but across the state, and additional information to help with any specific information, specific issues that might arise in people's minds for how to deal with things. So. So that's a quick cruise through our website, and a lot of great information. I hope that everybody can kind of take some time and look through some of what we saw. You can spend a lot of hours on the site, but that's a great way of sending people down the right road for answers and for solutions in a lot of cases. So I just in closing, I just appreciate the opportunity that we had to be here today to talk about something that people are talking a lot about, for the last 2 or 3 years. Appreciate the chance to talk about coyotes and talk about coyote management. More than glad to discuss as we go, down the road, as things come up that you want to ask about, or we provide technical guidance, as an agency, we're working with homeowners, landowners, and communities and municipalities as well to help make sure that we can go down the road in a beneficial way for our resources and for our people. So in the end, I think it always pays to be creative and to think openly about what is coming or where we've been, and particularly when it comes to wildlife solutions. This is something that came up. Somebody sent me a link to what I would call an innovative approach for dealing with some of the concerns that people have. I don't know where this came from, but it certainly makes a really nice picture for what we see there. I certainly wouldn't mess with anything that looks like that. So I'm going to close with that. I've actually got some cards with our wildlife helpline on there. More than glad to give you one of those, or a few of them if you got more than one person to hand one to. Is there anything else we need to cover that you can think of?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
You said when coyotes first come into an area, that they're typically their fur is typically black.
They can be.
Why would that be?
Yeah, you know, I don't know all the ins and outs of how that works exactly, but certainly genetically, you know, as you get a actual population that's sustaining itself, I certainly would think that some things just become less prominent as it. I'm not going to say watered down. You know, genes are still there, but they just show up less frequently. You know, that's kind of how I've always looked at it, that I'm not going to say you couldn't see a black coyote almost anywhere, but generally, you know, there may be some things that show up more regularly when the gene pool locally is not what it will be. So hard to say on that, but that's just something that I've noticed.
Not to get you too far off track, because this has been fascinating, but you know, being one of the 5 counties that does have these hunting regulations, you mentioned it's because of the red wolf, and I know that in the 90s and probably the first decade of the 2000s that there was quite a effort to conserve the red wolf. Are you? Does that come into play at all? I didn't notice a red wolf tab here, but is that, or do you just kind of lump them in with the coyotes now? I don't know. I mean, or is
no,
that...
you know, we talk about coyote. We got coyotes statewide. Mm-hmm. So we basically, as a species, we have regulations to manage coyotes across the state. The 5-county area is different in that there are special regulations because there are wolves here in Dare County, and you know 4 other counties as well that have been basically the Albemarle Peninsula is where that lays. So you know, I don't have anything there because we're talking about coyotes.
Right.
You
but
know,
the wolves are part of your purview too. You guys are into the wolves. The Wildlife Commission deals with wolves as well?
As far as phone calls and that kind of thing, we get some of that. You know, the Fish and Wildlife Service has had that project, so that's been a federal project over the decades. But you know, certainly when people call, we discuss you know what is and what isn't when it comes to coyotes.
Got it.
So we're you know, this has been the last several years. Like I said, you know, we've had coyotes for quite a while now in most of the state, and as we continue to go down the road of managing our coyote population, I think it becomes very, very important to consider where we want to go statewide with coyotes. You know, not just here, not just on the Outer Banks or on the coast, but you know, regulations across the state become very important. So.
Chris, to clarify, I think I know what you're asking, Monica. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason for the extra restrictions for hunting where there are red wolves present is so that people cannot accidentally make a mistake and shoot a red wolf. That's a protected species, correct?
Yeah, I think that the intention of the regulation came through a federal injunction.
Right.
And that was the intention there, I think, was to set some special rules in place to work with that.
But that's why it's different in those 5 counties.
Probably why the coyotes like it.
CoyoteVest.com is what it is, and it also protects from hawks.
Thank you.
So there you go.
Any additional questions for Chris? Chris and Evan, we appreciate you joining us today, and Chris, excellent presentation, and really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, we've enjoyed it.